Hello and a warm welcome to this brand new Sustainability Education podcast. I'm Dr. Stefan Siegel, postdoc researcher at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. In sustainability education, ideas and assumptions exist that sound plausible, but that are at least questionable or even dangerous at a closer look. In this podcast, I want to discuss myths and facts about sustainability education and the things in between. For this purpose, I invite world-leading experts on environmental and sustainability education, educational psychology, and myth and misinformation research. This podcast series is part of the research project Identifying, Understanding, and Challenging Myths in and about Sustainability Education. My vision is a more evidence-informed, effective, and ethically responsible sustainability education, and I hope to push the boundaries of knowledge in this field. I would be most delighted if you listened in and joined our conversation. You can do so on all the usual podcast platforms. Enjoy listening. Professor Daniella Tilbury is a globally recognized expert in sustainability education, leadership, and policy development. She has played a crucial role in shaping international frameworks for sustainability education, working with supranational institutions such as UNESCO, various governments, and higher education institutions around the world. Tilbury's research and policy contributions focus on the transformation of education systems to foster sustainability, innovation, and future-oriented learning. Her work has been recognized with over 27 competitive grants and 18 awards, and she has over 120 publications and is therefore one of the most highly cited academics in the field of sustainability education. Daniella was a member of the board of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, the WWF Australia, that brought the Earth Hour to the world in 2007, and has been actively involved in international initiatives that inspire transitions towards sustainability and climate-positive futures. She is currently an honorary fellow at St. Catherine's College at the University of Cambridge and an advisor to the European Commission on Learning for Sustainability and the UK government's focal point at the UN Economic Commission for Europe on matters of education and environment. Daniella was university president, vice-chancellor, dean, director of research and chair at universities in the UK, Australia, Hong Kong, and Gibraltar. Her latest book, published in 2025, is called Education and Learning for Sustainable Futures, 50 Years of Learning for Environment and Change, and is an available open access resource. With a strong academic foundation and extensive practical experience, Professor Tilbury is a leading voice in the field of sustainability education, shaping policy and practice on a small and also a global scale. Accordingly, I'm very, very happy to be able to talk with her today about the scope, the purposes, and the potentials, and also the limits of sustainability education in higher education. So, hello, Daniella, where are you calling from?
Hi, Stefan. And thank you very much for your kind invitation and your introduction. It is a pleasure to be quizzed by you on sustainability education and its myths. I'm actually joining from the Rock of Gibraltar, which is the southernest tip of Europe, my home base, where I am currently working.
Thanks for being here. That sounds very lovely. I'm very happy to talk to you today. And let's start without further ado with the first thematic area. And it's about understanding sustainability education and educational myths. So educational myths and sustainability education could be considered hot topics. What comes to mind when you hear the terms myths in and about sustainability education?
I think it'd be a good starting point to be clear about what we mean by sustainability education before we start talking about myths. I think that's quite critical. And to me, sustainability education is about understanding our current relationship with the planet and how we can carve an alternative future by changing that relationship. And I personally make sense of the world by distinguishing between education about sustainability, which I see is about the science, the geography of climate change, biodiversity, understanding nature based solutions, for example, and distinguishing that between and education in sustainability, which refers to experiences of promoting immersion in nature, natural environments, building connections and empathy, and distinguishing that with what I call education for sustainability, which is what I am deeply engaged in. And for me, education for sustainability is about critically assessing decisions, choices, and understandings that influence our everyday lives and looking at ways in which we change our relationship and engagement with the planet. So, the learning process that comes with education for sustainability is different for me to the other two approaches, because education for sustainability is the only one that deeply examines and questions that unequal relationship that we have between society and environment and the different push and pull factors between it. In reality, I think, or in practice, educators tend to confuse these three different types of learning. And then we add environmental education as another terminology to the mix that adds to the confusion, which I'll come to later. So, for me, when I'm talking about sustainability education today, let me be clear, I'm talking about education for sustainability in that context. And to address the second part of your question, what does this have to do with educational myths? Well, an educational myth for me is an incorrect belief, an incorrect perception or understanding that influences how we teach and learn and address sustainability. And the reality is that all the discourses and narratives that underpin education for sustainability are packed with myths. Some of them are educational, and some of them are environmental, and some of them are just broader social agendas that are and ideologies that are influencing. And I look forward to talking to you about the differences of those and how we unpack them later on. I also want to say that, we recently launched a book called Education and Learning for Sustainable Futures 50 Years of Learning and Change for Environment. And the book traces a decade by decade evolution of the narratives of sustainability education. And through that, identifies some of those myths quite explicitly, showing how certain decades and certain social contexts promulgate a certain type of myth that gain prominence depending on what else is happening socially. So looking forward to talking more about this and unpacking it.
Oh, thanks a lot. I'm also very much looking forward to this. This sounds so intriguing what you just said. And the book you mentioned is also one reason why you're here today, because I really appreciate your overview because you're longer in this business and have a lot of experiences, also the different types of sustainability related educations, if you want to call them like that. In the last decades, sustainability education has taken up multiple forms like environmental education, education for sustainable development, which you mentioned, but also sustainability education, regenerative education, and so on. Are there fundamental differences between these approaches, or are they just kind of rebranding of old concepts? So, is there something fundamentally new in sustainability education, or is it just education done right?
It's a good question. And I think, again, your question has two questions in it. The
Sorry for
first
that.
question is, no, that's good. I think the first question is there such a thing that's distinguishable that is education for sustainability or sustainability education? And then the second part is, if so, how does it differ? Or does it differ at all from all these other labels? That's how I'm reading it. So I'll answer the first part. I think personally, fundamentally, education for sustainability is different. It exists and always has existed in a form where it questions our existing practices. It calls into the frame a rethink of educational practices, and it deeply brings with it a very reformist agenda to education. And that has been there from the very, very beginning of the concept. So even in the late 1970s, when the concept was starting to take form and particularly in the 80s, when sustainability as a language, as a terminology entered education, it has always had that sort of underpinning agenda: reform, reframe education if it's going to be fit for the future of this planet and for the future of the people. So I think that has been consistent in principle. So I'm talking in theory, in principle. That element has been consistent through the ages, and I think our book tracks that. The reality, though, however, is very different. How that is then interpreted in practice has changed and evolved over time. So I don't think that the concept was understood 50 years ago. And even today, there's some camps that are struggling to understand what this agenda is about. And so when you ask me the question, is it different? Is it different to environmental education? Is it different to regenerative education or transformative education? I can say that at one level it is different because it has a very particular agenda, which is reformatist. At another level, I can say that all these terms can act as labels, and it doesn't matter what you call it. What matters is what you do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And if your intention is to reform and reframe, but you decide to call it transformative education, then you are practicing sustainability education. If you are doing things that are about raising awareness, about increasing understanding of sustainability, then to me, that is different. Because your ultimate intention is not to reform and reframe education and therefore change our relationship with the planet. So rather than judging the labels and whether they are different or not, it's about what is the intention and how is it practiced. If that becomes clear and there's a clear use of critical and systems thinking, empowerment and engagement of the learner, and this ambition to change the current status quo, then yes, they're one and the same.
Mm. I think that's a very valid point. Thanks for pointing at that. When I'm in research, I often ask myself the question when I hear all these concepts, whether it's sometimes also new frameworks that are developed, whether it's kind of a sophisticated form of intellectual procrastination, if we don't put them into practice.
Yeah.
But what you
Yes.
said there, I think if you really take them seriously and if you understand them very well and put them to practice, then it's something different.
Yes, and I think to follow up with that, the evolution of how we translate it into practice improves over time.
Mhm.
So although the concept hasn't changed, how we practice it is evolving because we understand that certain approaches are more effective at getting to our goal than others. So, the whole school approach, for example, is seen as being more effective, or the whole institutional approach to getting to that goal. Or, as I said, transformative agendas and reformist agendas that question the real purpose of education is. When we get to those types of questions, then we are really getting to the fundamental questions of what sustainability education really is about.
Yeah. And if I get that whole school or whole institution approach correctly, it moves on from education on sustainability more towards education in or even as sustainability.
Yeah, I'm not too fond of education as sustainability as a concept. I know Stephen Sterling has written a lot about it, and I align a lot with Stephen's thinking, but I don't necessarily like the concept of education as sustainability. To me, education has to have a transformative role in society. And I think that education as sustainability can sometimes be a little bit too pacifist for my view. To have a critical edge, to question deeply, to be able to bring about the change, it has to have more of an edge on questioning and redefining rather than just simply resort to practicing.
Based on your experience in research and practice, what are some of the most pervasive myths or maybe questionable ideas or psychological barriers that you have come across in sustainability education?
Wow, there's so many. There's so many. This is why I think your research is so interesting because, it's time that we started unpacking these. I'll start with the easy ones that,
Yes.
you know, let's start with the easy ones. Sustainability is only about the environment. Okay. That's ridiculous. If we want to move this agenda along, we need to understand how the environment is influenced and impacted by our social and economic decisions. So something I have a dislike for is the three circles overlapping and the shaded bits in the area. I just think that that distracts from what this agenda is really about. But that is a common myth that, if you do anything that falls within those three circles, you're doing sustainability education. I do not see it in that way. It really has to be that you are looking at, an entry point, which could be social, it could be economic, it could be environmental. It doesn't matter what your entry point is. But if you don't unpack that entry point within a context of understanding social, economic, and environmental influences and the interplay between them, then you're not doing sustainability education. So that myth of, it's only about the environment. Taking kids to a nature park and leaving them to explore nature, to me, is not sustainability education. It really is not. It's easier to say, let's go to the fridge, open the fridge and see what's in the fridge and start analyzing where the food comes from, how the food is produced, what impact the food has on our health, how we make choices that affect the planet and ourselves. That's sustainability education. You do not have to be in the wild to experience it. Although, of course, there is a value and benefit to that. But that in itself is not sufficient. That is my view. So that's a key
So
myth.
just being outside in nature doesn't foster necessarily systems thinking, for instance.
Exactly. It might foster empathy. It might foster a relationship with environment, which is why it's a useful, it's helpful, it's a valuable educational approach. I am not dismissing that. But so too is climate science. Climate science brings a lot to this that's important. But climate science in itself is not sustainability education. And this is where the myths lie. When there was a lot of national reporting about sustainability education, there's a lot of auditing in universities about what they are doing in response to the SDGs. And what you get is just building knowledge and understanding about very specialist areas without really unpacking or questioning those relationships and alternative ways forward. Without that, it's just not going to happen. Then, there's a lot more myths. Let's talk about sustainability education as being too complex for young students. That's ridiculous. I was trained as an early educator, and I can tell you that the work of Julie Davis, Sue Elliott, Diana Boyd, they have proven, they have shown, not just through evidence, but through experience, that there are age-appropriate lessons and teachings that can build around community responsibility, sustainability actions, engagement with others to try and address issues. It is not too complex for young students. And I think that the sooner we engage with this concept, the sooner we embed it within our educational systems, the more effective we're going to be at addressing this core issue. And then, there's others. Let me raise, I've worked in Switzerland quite a bit, and I know that in Switzerland, sustainability is sometimes seen as being indoctrinating or telling students what to think. And I have to say, it's the opposite. And those who think that do not understand what this agenda is about. It is the complete opposite. What it tries to do is identify bias, identify ideological influences by encouraging critical thinking, by encouraging informed decision making, by getting to the root causes of claims and statements. And therefore, this is why it is quite threatening to education today, because educational practices at the moment are, forgive me, sometimes too superficial, because they embed on communicating certain facts and not questioning the origins of those, not understanding the root causes of the situations we're embracing. And therefore, to me, that is a massive myth that is distorting engagement with this agenda. Another myth, there is no consensus about what this agenda is about, and there's many different ways in doing it. Disagree completely. A myth to me that is very damaging to this field. There has been consensus from the start, from the experts, those who've been engaged in this agenda for a long time, those who have studied this agenda. There is consensus about what sustainability education is and is not, about how we progress this agenda over time. It's been there, it's consistent, but what we have, especially more recently, is as new stakeholders come and join the movement, so to speak, they bring their own ideological baggage and they bring their own interpretations of what they think should happen in the field, which is fair enough because we do need to broaden the engagement and the involvement of stakeholders for making this a successful educational movement. But what we're not seeing is that there is a history to this where we have learned from mistakes, that we have learned about myths that exist that have been damaging to the field. And unless you have that understanding and that experience, you will find that you will be saying things, oh, there's no consensus. But that's because you have not really engaged deeply enough with the fields to be able to identify what its core characteristics, its definitive area of work is about. And again, in our book, we tackle this. We tackle about how this can be, this is a necessary thing to happen, the broadening of stakeholder engagement and the bringing in of colleagues who've been working, say, in environmental advocacy, for example. But their language, their approaches to environmental advocacy are not necessarily educational. They're not underpinned by educational theory or understanding of learning. And therefore, we start getting situations where particular outcomes are being defined and educational processes not being understood of how the learner needs to engage through a process of values clarification, critical thinking, making up their own minds of where they sit and how their influences, their parents, their communities, their experiences are influenced where they've come from and where they're going. Without that learning, then we begin to get into tricky territory.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that's another myth that I think is really, really important. My biggest concern is this practice about auditing curricula to see where environmental and sustainability issues lie, to say this is where or how we're engaging with sustainability. So again, another myth, the implementation of SDG thematic issues in the curriculum is sustainability education. I'd like to bust that particular myth.
So that
Because
it's sometimes a checkbox exercise.
totally. And it's again dangerous because it's been mainstreamed in a very diluted form, removing its critical edge, its ability to challenge education processes and practices. Because then it just becomes, where do I find it? Tick, tick, tick. Where can I put it in? Tick, tick, tick. Without actually changing anything else. And as I say, learning for sustainability education in this has a particular edge. It is a new set of glasses. It's a new way of seeing the world. It's about a new way of engaging with people and planet. And for that to happen, we need to change our current educational practices. So we embed themes rather than question how we go about educating and learning, then nothing will change. Is that enough for the moment? I've got a lot more themes, but I don't want to take over your podcast.
Um, you mentioned so many myths, as you said. Sustainability education seems packed with those, at least questionable beliefs. And I do think as well that they can be dangerous. But before we look at their potential negative effects and also how to deal with them, I would like to go to the question, what do you think? Where are these myths coming from? What cultural or societal factors contribute to the formation of these myths? Who spreads them? So there are a couple of questions popping up in my mind.
Yeah. I don't think I've given this a bit of thought after reading your questions, and I don't think that it is always intentional to spread these myths in a way that is going to distract or dampen the impact of learning for sustainability. It's a little bit like fake news. There is a core of people that are set out to disinform and distract. There are in fake news, particularly with climate science, for example. right? They exist. And then there's about 80% of others engaged in misinformation that don't have the time or the skills or the experience of debunking, the inaccuracies or questioning the assumptions underpinning these particular fake news, right? And so the danger is not just those who come up with it to protect their own interests, and there are a few of those in sustainability education who are protecting their own patch. But I think the large majority of people who spread these myths are people who really have not had the time or the skills to question more deeply the educational assumptions, the environmental assumptions, and those foundational myths that are propagating these particular misconceptions. So, there are things like the economy and the ecology, they have to be at opposite ends of the social engagement, that they cannot be married successfully together because environmental stuff is too expensive. That's just a myth. That's not true at all. But that underpins a lot of the work in schools when we talk about, for example, let's, transition the schools to be sustainable schools. And there's, oh, it's too pricey. Well, actually, it's not. It really is not. There might be some upfront investments, but at the end of the day, the beneficiaries are not just well-being and health, they're also economic. The issue of the one-size-fits-all solution is another foundational myth that I think is not understood. Sustainability is complex. When we look at environmental energy solutions, for example, there's no understanding that actually we're going to be needing a variety of ways in which we address the energy crisis, not just one particular solution. So that's another myth that underpins unquestioned bias in a lot of the work. And then there are the educational myths, the children learn better in one particular way. They learn better by being exposed to nature. And if you don't have those early experiences in nature, you will never be an environmentalist.
Mhm.
I question all of that. The evidence is just simply not there, right? It's not there. And although there are anecdotes and although there are small scale studies that suggest that there are improvements in well-being to the learner's benefit, and that there is a lot of educational value in being exposed to nature, I accept all of that. But doing nature and outdoor learning as a replacement for the other forms of sustainability education, as I say, the evidence is simply not there. So having that as being part of a diverse way of engaging in learning styles and learning approaches is one of those educational myths that needs to be busted. And there was so many. There were so many in terms of, conceptions about participatory learning, students learning, or the one that at the start of my career was driving me bananas, was that you have to start with knowledge. You have to start with knowledge. You start with knowledge, and that's once you know about it, you definitely then will change your mind about it. And when you change your mind about it, you will definitely then act because you feel responsible. That's a total myth, right? You don't necessarily need to start from knowledge. Knowledge is not necessarily going to empower and engage you to want to do something about this agenda. In fact, too much knowledge can be disempowering. You can create a sense of overwhelming sense of disempowerment, of not being able to do things. If we don't have the skills for engagement, the competences to deal with that knowledge and understanding, then you're finding that there's very young people that are disengaging with this agenda. So, those myths are important to be tackled too, because I feel that Greta's generation is being betrayed. I do feel that Greta has a point. We are betraying, education is betraying that generation by giving them concern and worry through giving them lots of knowledge, but not necessarily the skills and capabilities to inform and influence effectively the way that we take this forward.
Mm. Maybe we move from that neatly on to the next point. What do you think? What are the most harmful myths, and how do they impact educators, students, policy, society? So, what's the harm?
Harm is massive. Particularly when, another myth I haven't mentioned is this idea of if we all recycle and do our bit at home, everything will be fine. This individualistic approach of you do your bit and then things will work out. That's another myth that I think needs to be deeply questioned. Without collective action, without structural change, we are not going to be advancing this agenda. So bringing it back to the individual and solely focusing on individual change, that's very damaging to the individual because it places responsibility on the individual and guilt, and as I say, can
Mm.
create a sense of powerlessness because when you start trying to change things and see that it doesn't work on your own, you then go into a level of saying, well, what's the point of this? So it disempowers people. So I think that that's a very dangerous element on that perspective. I also think it is a distraction,
Mhm.
which means that we are not getting those changes done in time and quickly enough. The transition of education towards a more sustainable paradigm will take a lot of time. And we are starting late already. And these myths are delaying tactics. They are diverting, they are delaying the really critical action, which is to transform teaching, learning, and educational practices more broadly. And that's where I personally get very frustrated
Mhm.
because the minute that these narratives, which are informed by environmental or economic or, educational myths come into play, it's almost like the agendas are being hijacked.
Mhm.
When they get hijacked, that means that the energy and the space for us to take forward a more transformative agenda gets weakened. Yeah, and now I'm sort of as a person engaged with this agenda, I'm learning to respond to it differently. But when I started as an early career
Mm.
um, person engaged with this agenda, I used to get very cross. I used to get very upset, because it was being diluted, it was being averted, it was being delayed. But then I understood that, of course, this is not an easy task. This is not something that we're asking people to do, that it requires a slight change. We're asking them to transform the way they see the world, to transform the way they live their lives. And that can in itself be quite overwhelming too. And so we need to scaffold and help people take those steps forward in a way that will encourage them to question attempts to dilute the agenda.
Yeah.
Um,
In episode 2 of the podcast, I had Gail Sinatra here, who works a lot on conceptual change. And she says it's very hard to do that, especially if certain beliefs are within your core set of beliefs, like your most inner beliefs in your web of beliefs. Then it's pretty hard because they're sometimes tied to your identity.
Yes, but I think that's where good sustainability education can be most effective. When people have deeply held views, it means that they have values determining the way that they act and think. And actually, I have seen this in practice when I have worked with teams. Those who are the most adamant that it's not going to work, when you use educational approaches to question and unpack it, they're the ones that are most engaged at the end of the process because they're values driven. And when you question and explain to them and help them go through that reflective journey of understanding where their views have come from, what has influenced their particular views in life, and how those could be changed in a different direction if they wished to, and that they could explore other ways of seeing the world, they can be quite powerful. In fact, the ones that are harder to change are the ones that are not engaged in any agenda and don't have firmly enrooted beliefs of anything, because
So
they are
if I
harder, much harder to engage.
Mhm. So if I understood you correctly, you would like to move away in sustainability education from like this very fact-based teaching, education on sustainability, more to a value-driven, value-reflective, value-explicit education, that this is the core of sustainability education, that it's not value neutral, that in fact it's value laden?
No, because I am talking about equipping the person, the learner, with a set of new glasses. And that set of new glasses is not just to look out into the world to see the world differently. It's a set of glasses to look internally, to question and think about what has informed and influenced your worldview. And part of that worldview could be values, but not always. So I do not advocate for a values-based approach. I'm saying that values can be part of it. In some people, it's a very important part of it. For other people, it is not. The set of glasses will reveal what drives you. And for some people who are values driven, then it becomes a values clarification exercise. For other people that are driven or make sense of the world in a different way, then a different approach and a different engagement is required. So I do not support a values driven approach to sustainability. I think it's part of that process of unpacking why we engage with the physical environment and with other people in the way that we do.
Thanks for clarifying. Do you think that sustainability education can be value neutral, or sustainability educators can act or teach value neutral?
I don't find those terms helpful.
Hmm?
I think there is a confusion between the processes of promoting particular values and promoting a particular way of seeing the world
Yeah.
and learning for sustainability. So for me, the learning process is one of deeply questioning and engaging in exploring alternative ways of seeing the world to the one you currently see it in. It
Mm.
is not about making sure that by the end of the educational process, everybody is engaging with nature, everybody is, keeping a pet at home, everybody is bioorganic. No. So for me, education, the process is really much about unpacking, questioning,
Mm.
and transforming the way in which we prepare people to address their future lives.
Mm. To clarify my point as well, I'm totally against like indoctrination or very transmissive sustainability education. But on the other hand, I see that there is a need to foster the reflection on values, to foster value discussions, to foster dilemma situations, etc., and think critically about them, but not to tell people what to think, but give them empower them how to think and come to their own conclusions.
Exactly. And that's values clarification. So, and there's sometimes confusion between values education and values clarification. So, values clarification is that unpacking. You have an apple and you start unpacking, getting well below the surface to get to understand the root of what has influenced the way you think. And then exposing people, and this is a very important part that gets missed, exposing people to alternative ways of seeing the world. Um, because if that doesn't happen, and that can be a teacher saying, "This is how I see the world, and this is how I think." Now, that to me is not indoctrination. That's not values education. That's an example of how a person has come to their own views and what those are. And I think we need to expose our young people, particularly, to more of that type of education. I hope this is making sense.
Yes,
It sounds very
for me,
rhetorical at the moment, doesn't it?
you mentioned so many myths already. In my habilitation, my main aim is to work on and develop a psychomythology, how Lilienfeld and colleagues call it, for psychological myths. So it's basically a web or a wiki of myths in and about sustainability education, a collection of these myths and also refutations to them. With a view to your many years of experience in research and practice in this field, which myths should definitely be included? And do you think that there are foundation myths?
I do think there's foundation myths. I do think that there is important to classify the myths. And when you are, doing this mythology format, that you classify the environmental myths, the economic myths, the educational myths, the technological myths. They will bring in electric cars and they'll have no impact, so we'll sort that out. We don't need to engage too deeply with things. Or that, as I said before, that sustainability is too complex for young learners as an educational myth, or that sustainability alone can teach science education alone should be teaching sustainability. There are all these myths that are foundational in many ways that then ripple out into how sustainability is practiced in higher education, in schools, in the vet sector. I think it's really important to identify myths that allow you to get to the origin of the outdated research and the narratives that exist. Because myths exist because there's sometimes an oversimplification of what's happening. So, not all myths are entirely untrue. There is usually an ounce of truth in a myth, but they either get oversimplified or they get rippled into something else. There's also the influence of the media and social ideologies that influences the myths. I think looking at those is also very important. And there's also an element of outdated educational research that has taken, like Piaget, which was, wonderful work about how young people learn. But, come on, this was almost a century ago now. As far as I'm concerned, we've moved on so far since then. And we're still teaching teachers particular foundational concepts about education that perhaps also need to be challenged. So the origin of the myths for me are really important when you do this mythology. I
Mm.
also think impact is important. Some of them are more impactful than others in terms of the consequences. So looking at those will be important.
Mm.
There's two things that for me have helped me understood. Critical thinking gets you to a certain level of understanding. But then I think, one really needs to read and be challenged to take it to the next level, the deeper level of understanding. The work of David Pepper in the early 1980s with the roots of modern environmentalism, to me, was critical in understanding the tensions and the myths at the bottom of what drives the environmental agenda. And then John Huckle's work
Mm.
in terms of translating all of this into educational practice has been very, very inspirational to me. David Hicks is another one. I think, by yourself and critically reflecting, you can get to one level, but you really need to be challenged by others, another world perspective, and much deeper thinking about this agenda to really get to another level of understanding what is really going on to distract us from the true task of rethinking our relationships with people and planet.
Mm. I couldn't agree more. When I do look at certain claims in sustainability education, I try to use different tools. For instance, a myth busting decision tree. So to not debunk every myth that I come across, to look a little bit for which is impactful, which is widespread, which is kind of a battle I want to choose. And another tool I use is education myths refutation canvas that I developed, and where you look very systematically at the myth, at the origins of the myth, the sources, whether there is prevalence for it, and then also at the consequences, potential consequences, and also the possibilities of prevention. And I find that quite helpful to really get to the bottom of these statements.
This is really helpful, and I think the work you're doing is going to be so, so valuable. I really do. I think
Thanks.
having time to think about this more deeply and bring your own views on this will be helpful to everyone. I really do. One thing that I have learned is to understand the groups
Mhm.
of people. So categorizing groups in many ways. So those who support nature and outdoor education have particular beliefs and views. And so certain myths will resonate more with them than others. Those who are working in the consumer education area will have particular assumptions and views, and other myths will resonate more with them. So what I'm saying is that it's sometimes easy to understand myths by understanding who is,
Mhm.
I wouldn't say pushing them, but adopting them as a ways of explaining or rationalizing the work that they're doing.
Oh, wow, that's a super new perspective for me. At the moment, I'm more in the process of categorizing those sustainability education myths to, for instance, myths about learners in sustainability education, teachers, contents, the competencies or aims or goals in sustainability education, learning methods, and so on. But you said it could be valuable to look at the persons that hold these ideas
Yes.
and in which contexts or fields they work, and to also see what their values are, what motivates them, etc.
Yeah, their worldviews, because I think that that's part of the answer of how to debunk them too.
Yeah.
So, context is everything for these myths,
Mhm.
and understanding context I think is really interesting. And when we're looking at, we have a lot to learn from the fake news platforms, I think, in terms of how they debunk in young people, and how they equip teachers with strategies to help young people debunk myths. I think it could be really interesting also to look at that area, the strategies that they are using to help to question, to help to prepare educators, teachers, others engaged in this agenda to question and understand some of these myths.
Mhm. Speaking exactly of that, how to deal with those myths. From your experience, what are strategies that have been effective in identifying, analyzing, and dispelling those myths? Or what could we learn from misinformation, disinformation, and endeavors that are taken there?
Yeah, so starting with the last question, I mean, I've only recently started to delve into that area and learning
Mhm.
myself from it. So I wouldn't consider myself an expert in that in any way. But I would say that pre-bunking, in other
Mhm.
words, attempting to prepare learners, educators, and those engaged with this agenda before they're exposed to it tends to be more effective than trying to dissuade those who have been exposed to this viewpoint. So I think teacher education will be very critical
Mhm.
in debunking some of these myths. And particularly initial teacher education is very critical.
So pre-bunking, for the listeners, there are several types of inoculation. It's like a
That's right.
protective vaccine that can build antibodies or a mental immunity against some questionable claims.
Exactly. I mean, I'm not particularly aligned with the vaccine analogy, but I fully understand what the authors are trying to do there. The leaders of this agenda are doing by adopting that terminology. And I do, having read their papers, having read the work they've done, I can understand how effective this can be. So I think there's some cross fertilization there between their work and what you're trying to do. I think it could be very interesting to
Mhm.
explore that.
What do you see critical about the metaphor or analogy?
Are you saying why don't I like the analogy? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, is it kind of it could frighten people?
Um, there's a lot of anti-vaxxers.
Mhm.
Um, so then you start by using that terminology, you start getting into another level of it's a distraction for me.
Mhm.
I think that could distract. You can start fighting another area, which is worth fighting for, but not necessarily in the space of what you're trying to do. So I would avoid using that terminology, but the concept itself, I think, is very attractive.
Yeah. So pre-bunking inoculation as a very effective means of dealing with those myths.
Yes, yes, and I think from experience, I think the best way to start with any type of program, support, resources that work in sustainability education, I think the work you're doing is going to be helpful because you do not assume that teachers and educators and learners are starting on a blank sheet. You are recognizing that they bring with them misconceptions
We
as
all
well
do.
as yeah, as well as some knowledge and experience of what works,
Mm.
right? So they're bringing knowledge and experience and interests, which are massive positives. But also, I think when you are sharing a resource, when you're doing a training program, equally, as well as building on that experience and recognizing those unique insights that educators and learners bring, you have to have the other half of this, which is recognizing that they also bring incorrect assumptions, misconceptions about what this is really about and how most effective learning can take place in this agenda. So, speaking very honestly with you, when I do any work in this area, I make sure that there's elements of both of those happening in, say, a professional development program.
Mm.
We start by celebrating good practice, recognizing the good ideas that are brought to the table, but we certainly reserve some space to question and unpack assumptions and challenge pretty assertively things that may be contradicting the work that is happening in this agenda.
That sounds very appreciative, and I think that's a good combination and a valuable one. For me, it's always important that myths can also have a positive functions. They let us function in stressful situations, but of course, they're sometimes diametral to professional action and evidence-informed action.
Yeah, I mean, a good question to ask would be, why do people like adopting these myths? You know,
Mhm.
they might offer security blankets. They might, it might be they resonate with their worldviews, or it might be that they feel comfortable. The blankets give them the fake agendas, give them a sense of security, that they might be needing. And so that also has implications for how you debunk.
Mm. Security, complexity reduction, etc., etc.
Exactly.
Um, an interesting aspect about these myths is to use them also as hooks, as learning opportunities, and as learning catalysts. So I also see value in those myths because they can be interesting to contrast them with differentiated beliefs, with good, also ideally sticky, scientific alternative explanations. But that's a tension there.
Yes. Yes, there is a tension there. There is a tension, and some people will respond better to those tensions and find that as a really interesting hook to learn more about it. And others will find that beyond their comfort zone. Again, finding different pathways for engaging educators and learners with this agenda, not
Mm.
assuming that one size fits all will help.
What do you think? What is the role of higher education institutions and also leadership? You worked in that role quite a lot in dealing with those myths.
Ah, it's a really complex question to answer.
We're tackling the difficult questions as well here.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer, not just in higher education, but in any sector you're working in. We know what needs to be done. I
Mm.
think we know, what works and what doesn't work. But then there's the question of the buy-in, and how do you approach this in a way that builds in ownership, that builds in buy-in, that
Mhm.
gives confidence rather than becomes too big a job for people to want to take it on. And that's the bit I think we've got the least research done on.
Okay.
That's where the evidence gap is. I think there have been lots of academics working on definitional aspects of this agenda, and lots of academics quickly pointing to the challenges and obstacles of this agenda.
Mm.
Um, but where's the research that says, these are effective processes for social transformation in higher education institutions? I mean, a recent piece of work I've done for the European Commission has asked me to look at um, leadership theories in higher education for sustainability in practice. Um, and there's like 13 wonderful theories on how this could be done. And all of them bring something very valuable, whether we're talking about distributed leadership, transformative leadership. They all have
Mhm.
elements that can help build competencies of leaders in universities and colleges for this agenda. But they're just theories. Where is the evidence base? Where are the documented examples where we can really learn from in terms of translating this ambition, wrestle with the complex agenda of the realities of these institutions in ways that takes the agenda forward? There are wonderful case studies too, but none of them get down deep enough or are comparative enough that identify those key points of traction yet.
Mm. I think there are research gaps and avenues. So if anyone feels like going into there, that would be highly valuable and relevant. Before we come to the end of this interview, with my other guests, I've done sort of a quick round on statements. Um, so with other guests, I've discussed a lot of these potential myths on rather on a micro level. As you are an expert in leadership and educational policy as well, I would love to present you some potential myths more on the meso and macro level of, for instance, higher education institutions.
Sure.
And I would love you to indicate whether you see them as myths, facts, or something in between, because often it's not entirely clear. And if you want to, you can add a brief explanation of your reasoning. Is that
Okay.
fine for you?
Yeah, sure. Sounds good.
So statement one would be integrating sustainability into the university's operations and curriculum is too complex, too disruptive, and potentially causing more harm than good.
Myth. Absolute myth. It can be done. It has been shown to be done. You just need the vision and the willpower to engage with it, and the benefits it ripples are significant.
Okay, that's quite clear answer. Thanks. Statement two, focusing on sustainability might dilute the university core mission, transmitting knowledge. Higher education institutions should stay neutral.
Myth and something else at the same time. I think that bringing sustainability education into this area starts to question rather than align with. It starts to question. And what that means is it brings the transformative agenda into higher education. So I disagree with parts of that, but I also think I also agree with parts of that in the sense that it starts to question whether building knowledge and being key knowledge generators is the true core purpose of higher education.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Statement three, implementing sustainability will result in a significant pushback against change from faculty, students, and alumni.
Mixed.
Mhm.
There's a certain truth to that, particularly those who hold worldviews that this agenda is something different to what we've talked about. I have personally been working in this field for a while and know that there are a lot of eager students that want to transform what higher education practices look like now. And they are keen for sustainability education to open that door to transform learning experiences. Equally, there are some very disengaged tutors and teachers in higher education that are looking for a purpose in what they're doing, and sustainability speaks to them.
Mhm. Statement four, there is little demand from students, employers for sustainability focused education, making it a risky strategic direction for higher education institutions.
Total myth, the complete opposite. Complete opposite. You just need to look at employability surveys, student engagement. Go to any employer who most of them are already have the sustainability strategies in place, reporting for the CSRD. So, no, complete myth.
Yeah. And the last statement, the return on investment for sustainability programs is uncertain and unlikely to justify the costs involved. I think you already debunked that. But
Yes, it's a myth. And I think the question is timescales. It takes a little longer to benefit from it than people are wanting, but certainly a myth.
so, when we come to the end of the interview, what do you think? What are some pressing questions that future research on these myths in and about sustainability education should address?
It's a good question. I think we've covered a lot of it already. Perhaps I'll take a minute rather than look back at what we said, but just introduce something we have not spoken about that I think is quite critical to this agenda, which is futures and anticipatory governance and futures thinking. To me, this is a core definitional aspect of what makes sustainability education or sustainability agenda different to other agendas. We haven't really spoken about that today. And I think that a futures aspect of this brings hope, brings empowerment, brings alternatives, brings new methodologies of how to attract interest of learners, educators, and leaders, and has the potential to be a doorway for everything else we've spoken about.
Mm. I think that's a vital point that you mentioned there. In the beginning, I thought I have to tell my students and other people who I wanted to educate on sustainability how dire the situation is, like point to the planetary boundaries that we have transgressed and the Earth clock. And of course, I know that doom and gloom and fear is not a good educator or not a good means of educating, but it has been done that way. And I thought I had to do it in a similar fashion. But I think pointing to positive visions, potentials, inspiring hope, etc., is very, very effective, and we need that more.
Yes, and also at the leadership level, absolutely agree with what you said, but also in terms of, when we're talking about what are the benefits, why engage, isn't this going to bring me more problems rather than opportunities, that sort of discourse. I think that the future anticipatory governance frameworks and looking at intergenerational justice as a concept and that sort of perspective brings a different dimension to the discourse when you're trying to justify strategies, certainly at the higher education level, for transforming universities towards sustainability.
Before we conclude, is there anything else you would like to add or emphasize?
There's so much to be done still, and I'm really grateful that you've picked up the baton here and looking at alternative ways in which we can address some of the core issues and not just come up with another label or another set of perspectives, but actually looking far more deeply and critically about what's happening and why. So I'm really grateful to you for, as I say, picking up on where we need to go next and helping to uncover new ways of advancing this agenda. Thank you. Really, really, really thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad for your support and also the time you took for this podcast. And I was really intrigued and fascinated by a lot of things you've said. And I would continue another couple of hours, but I know you're quite busy. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you for your interest in the Sustainability Education Podcast. Did you find the insights helpful? Do you have any questions, comments, or objections? Then feel free to get in touch and share this episode with others. This podcast is produced by the Institute of Business Education and Educational Management at the University of St. Gallen. Thank you for listening and hear you in the next episode. Bye bye.